Optimal health for high performers. This is the Health Upgrade Podcast with Dr. Nawaz Habib.
Hi, everyone. It's Dr. Habib, and we're back with you on the Health Upgrade Podcast with JP. How are you, sir?
Doing all right. Big day today.
Big day for you. Dropping your daughter off to college. First one. So,
yeah.
Big deal. Big deal. Big day. We want to talk about energy, and we want to talk about mitochondria, specifically because mitochondria are the powerhouses of our cells. We do know that that's well established, and the research clearly shows that mitochondria are key to ensuring all cellular function is optimized. There is a specific process that mitochondria go through that causes them to become inefficient. And I'd love to dig into this particular process with you. It's called mitochondrial uncoupling. So why don't we talk a little bit about the basics of mitochondria just to set the table, set the stage, get people to know where we're at, and then we can talk about this process by which mitochondria actually become uncoupled.
Yeah, I think mitochondria, we've talked about it before, are the basics of cellular metabolism, and cellular metabolism is one of those four pillars that we always talk about in terms of the most important things that happen in life: energy, immunity, the autonomic nervous system, and the microbiome. But specifically, mitochondria are almost their own life form. In fact, at one point in evolutionary history, they were their own life form. We refer to them as the power plants of the cell, and I think it's a reasonably good analogy to think of them like a power plant. So if you imagine, what a power plant, whether it's a nuclear power plant or a coal-fired power plant or whatever, basically most power plants work by generating some sort of heat, and that heat boils water, and then the water, the steam that's generated, is at a high pressure. And then you use some sort of turbine to extract energy out of that high pressure steam to generate either low pressure steam or just convert it back to water. Well, mitochondria are like that. In fact, if you think about the analogy, they have fuel, they are generating energy, not boiling water in this case. What they're doing is creating a gradient. And a gradient really just means a separation of anything, really. You could separate colors into a gradient, and that would be the rainbow. But in this case, you're separating charges. So you're separating protons from electrons. So there's a positive charge with protons and a negative charge with the electrons, and you're separating them. And we do that, mitochondria do that across what's called the inner membrane. So there's a membrane of phospholipids, much like the membrane of a cell, because at one point it was a membrane of a cell. And that separation of charges works almost like a battery, or like the high pressure steam and the low pressure steam in the power plant. Now, as the steam goes across the turbine, the charges in the mitochondria are going through a protein machine. It's literally a tiny little machine called ATP synthase. And part of the machine sits on the side where the electrons are, and part of it sits on the side where the protons are, and it creates a pathway right through the center of it. It's like a tube, so sort of like a turbine, and the flow of these particles turns a little wheel, and literally almost like a water wheel. But in this case, it's churning, and every time it turns about a third of the way, it creates a new ATP by attaching a phosphate onto an ADP molecule. So you can imagine in your head that it's sort of like a power plant. Now, the flow of steam through a turbine is generating power because it's turning the turbine, okay? But what we're talking about in the case of mitochondria is not a flow of steam, but a flow of charge. Now, in a turbine, you can get steam at too high a pressure sort of slipping through the generator, and that's waste. And so you end up with some steam that hasn't really lost its energy coming through. Sort of the same thing happens in mitochondria. If your gradient is too strong, there's too strong a flow of electrons or protons, depending on which direction the gradient's flowing, and you end up with sort of a backing up, almost like too much traffic going through. You end up with cars veering off the road. You end up with charges that are coming through and they're not being processed through the machine properly. And that leads to the creation of some pretty dangerous molecules. We call them free radicals or reactive oxygen species. And these are molecules that are very, very damaging. They will damage DNA. They will damage phospholipids. They'll damage proteins. They will damage structures and lead to a need for repair, but they can also lead to genetic mutation. It can lead to inflammation. It can, even if it's bad enough, trigger damage to the mitochondria, which will then lead the cell to commit suicide. So in many ways, we want to minimize the amount of this sort of backing up of the flow of charges. And that's what we can do that in a variety of ways. One is to restrict food intake, go on a little fasting. You can also reduce the amount of easy energy, if you will. It's probably wrong to call it easy because it's actually not the best form of energy, but that's sugars. Reduce the sugars and carbohydrates. Start letting your mitochondria use things like fatty acids to generate energy. They do it at a better pace. Mitochondria actually like that better. It's safer. So that's sort of the basics of mitochondrial, let's say, function.
In this analogy, you mentioned the free radicals, and I want to link in the analogy that to me, and when we have this congestion, when we have this excess traffic building up, it's almost like the people that become road ragers on the road, right? And these are the free radicals. And the more congestion and the more backing up and the less capable or the less efficient that the system is, the more of these road ragers are going to be present on the road, the more damage they're going to create, the more issues they're going to create with the other drivers. And that's where a lot of these issues will pop up, because in addition to having the congestion, now we have to deal with this excess backup or this excess issue of road ragers that aren't capable of regulating their emotions, unfortunately, in these situations. And you mentioned a couple of pathways by which we can clean up the free radicals a little bit or minimize them. Quickly, just to talk about the types of fuels that the mitochondria use effectively, we can talk about the macronutrients overall: carbohydrates, proteins, fats. So you mentioned fasting. That's where we have caloric restriction. That's where we have a pause on the consumption side of things entirely. And what you're essentially doing is you're saying, rather than the consumed energy source or the consumed macronutrients that are going to come through the gut, get into the bloodstream and go to the cell and that are readily available, instead of those as the primary fuel source during this low consumption period, we're going to mobilize the stored fuels that are currently present and utilize those instead. And at the same time, what it does is, rather than allow the energy to go to the consumption process in the gut, energy can then go to create the efficiencies of cleaning up those free radicals, cleaning up those damaged cells, those senescent cells that are created due to excess consumption or long-term consumption that doesn't work well. So that's where fasting works. On the macronutrient side, you mentioned carbohydrates, or we'll talk a little bit about carbs and fats in particular. Protein is a secondary or a tertiary source. It's only there as like just absolutely in case there's no source of energy, we're going to then use protein as a primary or as a fuel for energy production or for that metabolic process. Carbs and fats. Let's talk just a little bit about the differences in the style of fuel. I like to, when I talk about this with my patients, is I liken carbohydrates to ethanol 85, like the basic low quality fuel sources that generally are going to create a little bit more sluggishness, can have a little bit more breakdown of the engine. They're not as good or not as effective or efficient as something like an ethanol 93, or if we want to go next level, like jet fuel, right? Which is where I like to liken the fat energy sources to, the good quality fats. So there's a huge difference between an engine that runs on E85 and an engine that runs on a high octane clean fuel system. Talk a little bit about the difference between carbohydrates and fats.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to take your analogy and change it just a little bit and say there are sort of three different categories of fuel. You've got protein, you've got sugars and carbohydrates, and then you've got fatty acids, which is fats. And what I would say is that your sugars are really like that sort of 85 sort of really crappy fuel with lots of gunk in it. That's the stuff you don't really want to be using. It's easy to use, it's cheap, it's inefficient, but it makes your wallet feel good. And then on the other end you have the protein. The protein is sort of like the jet fuel. Okay? Yes, it's readily available. Okay? And for long distance runners, I'm one of them. There's no question that by the time I get towards the end of my runs, I'm using up protein. I've used up all the glycogen that's in my body within the first 20 minutes. Then, yes, I will convert into using some fats and ketones. But the truth is that I'm probably also using up augmenting that need for energy that's pretty high for an extended period of time. I'm using up some of that jet fuel, some of that protein. And then at night, you rebuild the muscle that you've broken down, the proteins that you've broken down. Fats are sort of like that in-between perfect fuel, 91 octane, very clean. It's got, all the detergents in it to make certain your fuel injectors stay clean. That's your fatty acids. That's really what you want to run on most of the time. So I think of that jet fuel. If you run your car on jet fuel, it's not going to last very long because it's going to melt the engine.
That makes sense.
Runs too hot, et cetera. So those are the two bookends, and then in the middle is where you want to be. It's like not too hot, not too cold, just right.
Yeah, the Goldilocks fuel.
Right, it's the Goldilocks fuel, and that's really what we grew. What we as human beings, evolutionarily relied on fats almost exclusively because there wasn't a lot of sugars and carbohydrates available, and then you also had at the other end you had occasionally protein, being available. When you took down a mammoth or something like that, you'd eat a lot of that. But they were also relying on fats more than anything.
Yeah, which makes a lot of sense. So we evolved to be able to use any one of these three. And sadly, over the last 50 to 100 years, our primary fuel sources have shifted heavily towards the carbohydrate side.
Yeah,
we've unfortunately demonized the fats. We've, to some extent, demonized especially animal source protein. And we are strongly leaning towards the carbohydrates and lower quality fats as primary fuel sources or primary sources of caloric intake into our bodies, right? So,
and that is fortunately shifting. We're seeing a movement, just like a pendulum. It's moving away from that. I think people are recognizing the consequences of that, the chronic diseases, type 2 diabetes, frankly, everything through cancer rates going up, and how it coincided with the introduction of these seed oils and ultra processed foods, et cetera. People are pushing back against that, and I like to see that. It's great to see. But getting back to the underlying problem that's leading to all that is this, mitochondrial dysfunction that's occurring as a result of the fact that we're not providing the cells with the right kind of fuels and giving it the right amount of time in that, what I'll call sort of like fasted state or catabolic state versus chronically in this anabolic, well-fed, overfed state. And one of the consequences of that is that we are ending up with our mitochondria and the creation of that energy becoming inefficient and damaging. You likened it to a road rage. I think of it more almost like, an alcoholic on the road, a drunk driver. If there's nobody else on the road, well, then, he might crash his own car and hurt himself, but he's not going to damage anybody else. But if, you're driving down a city street that's, very crowded with pedestrians and other cars and drunk and weaving, there's a lot of damage that's going to occur. And so what we want to do is we want to figure out ways to get the drunk drivers off the road. And one of the ways that the body does that, and it actually evolved for a separate reason, we'll talk about that in a second, but one of the ways that we do this is with proteins that are called uncoupling proteins. And if you think about that gradient that we talked about, where you've got this fat layer, that's the inner membrane of the mitochondria, and we're creating this charge gradient across the membrane. There's no way for these charges to pass through that membrane. It's like an insulator. And the only way to get through it is through that channel of the ATP synthase molecule, that protein. Unless you have little holes, little pores that are opened up in the membrane. It's sort of like little short circuits that are opened up that allow some of that charge to leak back down and dissipate without generating an ATP. But it has to do something because there was energy there. So what happens is it creates heat. So uncoupling proteins allow the mitochondria to give up the ghost, if you will, of making ATP with that. Instead of making ATP, it generates heat. And so it's thermogenesis. So part of the reason why, that's a really big reason, why we as warm-blooded creatures are able to maintain our body temperature is because we're using that energy of the food in the mitochondria to generate that gradient, but then we're taking it back, if you will, and turning it into heat. And that's why one of the discovery of this uncoupling process is kind of an interesting historical story. What happened was during World War II, there were bomb factories. People were using new chemical processes to make bombs. And they noticed that the workers who were working in these bomb factories were really thin, that they couldn't put on weight, that they were all ultra thin people, very, very, very low body mass indexes. And they were eating, no matter how much they ate, they couldn't gain any weight. And the scientists recognized that the reason was because they were using a chemical called 2,4-dinitrophenol. And, it's a nitrogen compound. It has, and nitrogen is big in bombs and explosives. But this form of this compound had the ability to short circuit the mitochondrial gradient. So it was basically causing these people to have very high temperatures. So their body temperatures on average weren't 98.6. They were sitting at like 101 all the time. So they were using up all of the energy that they were taking in just to heat themselves just a couple of degrees. And that led to then they started, well, if that's a great weight loss tool, let's start prescribing it to people. And what ended up happening was it actually can be lethal because if you have it in too large quantities, it can kill. And unfortunately, people are trying to cut weight and bodybuilders and all that. There's still a black market for using 2,4-dinitrophenol to try to lose weight. Not a good idea. Not suggesting it. It's a bad idea.
Disclaimer, do not use.
Yeah, do not use. But things like fen-phen and other ways, they're basically derivatives of that. So they're uncoupling proteins or uncoupling compounds. And so we can do that naturally. Okay, human beings can do that naturally. And one of the ways that we do that is through cold exposure. When you expose your body to cold, like in cold water plunges and things like that, or the surfers out on the West Coast who are in the cold Pacific Ocean all the time, man, they can't gain weight. They can't gain weight. But I've always thought it was interesting. There's a difference in the body of a professional swimmer, for example, or not a professional, but a high-class, world-class swimmer, and other athletes like a track star. You look at their bodies and different muscle usage, but there's just a smoothness, if you will, to the body of a swimmer versus the body of a track star. There's just fewer, you could see their veins, the skin's thicker. You see that in the track star versus the swimmer. And the reason for that is because the swimmers spend so much time in cold water that they've actually created a layer. I mean, we never call these people fat, but they have a layer of brown fat or beige fat that sits, and you say, well, okay, what is beige fat? Well, we know white adipose tissue, and we know we've heard brown fat. Well, what makes it brown? What is browning in that? It's the mitochondria.
Yep.
It's the concentration of mitochondria. And the reason is because, basic white fat, yeah, sure, it's somewhat insulating, but it's really just there as a storage vehicle for storing energy.
It's not metabolically active.
It's not as metabolically
not as much. Yeah.
It's certainly chemically active. It's certainly releasing adipokines and all the rest of of signaling molecules that come with that. But brown fat is, as you said, metabolically. Mitochondria are really super active in brown fat, and it helps to heat your body. It helps to get you capable of handling that level of energy need in the form of thermogenesis. So it's kind of neat.
There's really interesting studies that I shared in my last book when I was talking about temperature therapy and the use of cold as a therapeutic agent, but also as a priming agent. And so this was a really interesting study that I believe it was in either Denmark or Sweden. I forget exactly which country. It might have even been Norway. Might have just been a Scandinavian country practice. But babies, when they're born, are napped outside in cold temperatures. Yes, bundled in clothing, but the temperature that they're napped in their strollers outdoors is cold. They're put in a situation where they're meant to nap outdoors. What that does is it takes us out of this complete temperature controlled state that we in North America tend to be in. And there are times where you want to be in a temperature controlled state, of course. But I think what we've done is we've gone overboard and we're in a temperature controlled state 23 and a half to 24 hours a day. That's too much. When we are constantly under temperature control, we're not giving our bodies access to this hormetic stressor of some temperature change that your body then needs to adapt to. And we lose the ability to be resilient to temperature changes because we as humans are capable of living in temperatures anywhere between negative 30 and where I'm talking both Celsius and Fahrenheit here.
Yep.
To well over like 120 Fahrenheit, 40, 50 Celsius. It's not comfortable to be in those extremes by any means, right? But comfort's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about adding a piece of stress through a temperature therapeutic process by teaching your body to respond when the temperature around you changes. And so this is exactly the process by which mammalian dive reflex, in addition, has been shown to have an increase in HRV, right? Because what we have is you're getting into the dive reflex by not being able to inhale for a period of time. You're focused on a long, drawn-out exhale, slowing the respiratory rate, doing the autonomic shift of needing to be in a parasympathetic state in the water, but the temperature of that water is generally colder, right? We're not sitting in 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 98.6. It's not exactly aligned to the temperature that we are in usually. So when they get in the ocean, these surfers and swimmers get into the ocean or they get into cold water plunges or polar water dips, what they're doing is they're creating this exposure, causing the subcutaneous fat. This is the fat on the outer layers just underneath the skin. And there's a big difference between subcutaneous and visceral fat, which I'm sure we'll get into at some point down the road. A whole nother episode on that one. But what they're doing is they're triggering that subcutaneous fat to become more metabolically active. When we increase the metabolic activity of that causes those fat cells in the subcutaneous layers of the skin to produce more mitochondria and become more mitochondrially efficient. That turns the fat from white fat into beige or brown fat. That's literally the process. So temperature therapies are probably one of the strongest and most efficient ways to help to create that process of browning fat and increasing metabolic activity. I think that's huge. Anything to add on that?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. We are, unfortunately, creatures of comfort, And we're looking to find ways to make our existences less stressful. And I want to make the parallel here. We talk about the four pillars of health, and you've just talked about the autonomic nervous system and enhancing resilience through these hormetic stresses. But the same hormetic stresses that are good for making your autonomic nervous system more resilient also are making your mitochondria more prevalent. You're actually triggering biogenesis, the making of more mitochondria, and that's what the browning of the fat is, making more of them so that there's a higher concentration of them. But you're also making them more efficient. You're making them function in ways that they weren't before. They weren't as flexible. When you start exposing yourself to that cold and that discomfort, you are allowing your body to become chemically more functional, more resilient, more capable of dealing with all of the various different ways in which the environment can affect you. So it's a parallel because you can use either the autonomic nervous system or mitochondrial health as your justification for doing it, but you're going to end up with benefits in both.
I think you're absolutely right. The resilience is the key. That's really what we're trying to drive here, is the idea of being capable of responding to different inputs, different stressors. And I think probably the biggest take-home point here from outside of the science and more so on the habit change side of things is knowing the difference between being uncomfortable and being in danger, right? Sitting in a cold plunge for an hour, kind of dangerous. Sitting in a cold plunge for 3 to 5 minutes, probably, and not all the time, but probably very beneficial for somebody to be able to create that metabolic shift, right? We're noticing that there is this gradient that we need to understand in terms of, push yourself through that discomfort. Live a slightly less comfortable life and know that you are safe within a certain realm. And that safety is going to drive the psychological capabilities of your vagus nerve and your autonomic nervous system to become resilient. And in doing so, by enabling your body to enter these states of slight discomfort, what you're actually doing is you're increasing metabolic flexibility and metabolic resilience as well. In addition to this, being 80-20 or 90-10 with your diet, where you're eating your foods that you should be 80 to 90% of the time and allowing a little bit of leniency outside of that realm to trigger your mitochondria with some mild hormetic stress. A little bit is okay, because what you're doing is you're teaching your mitochondria to come back to its normal sense and enable some flexibility of the bacterial populations that are present within your gut. So that's a third pillar that we can add in there as well. Resilience and knowing that a little bit of discomfort, enabling that discomfort feeling and saying, I'm uncomfortable, but I know I'm safe within a certain amount, will enable that habit change that's required to create that resilience that people are seeking.
For sure. And resilience is the key, both in the mitochondria as well as in our autonomic nervous system. That's and truthfully, frankly, in your immune system and in your microbiome too. We don't spend a lot of time talking about those two in using the term resilience, but that's effectively what you want. You want a healthy microbiome and a healthy immune system to be able to tolerate shifts and changes that occur in environment and in your life, in the exposure to pathogens and exposure to stresses in general. There's other ways that you can enhance the level of mitochondrial uncoupling that's occurring in your mitochondria. Just to get back to that, because I know that people probably who listen to this, at least some of them are saying that 2,4-dinitrophenol sounds like a good idea. And I understand and I sympathize if you can think about the fact that, wow, if I could just take a pill and have my body temperature rise, which, by the way, very interesting, that 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit that we all sort of quote, we learn in school, that's a body temperature of a human being. Not so much anymore. In North America, in typical living in, a comfortable environment and not stressing ourselves, we're seeing body temperatures start to drop. the body temperature of the average North American is probably not much more than about 98.0. Okay. It's actually coming down. And that's why.
Shocking to me. I didn't actually know that.
Yeah, no, it's actually dropping. And the reason is because we are not mitochondrially healthy. There's too much mitochondrial dysfunction out there. You're not getting enough uncoupling. You're getting far more free radicals being generated. So, what are some foods rather than everybody going out and, trying to, first off, don't buy any 2,4-dinitrophenol because in addition to poisoning yourself, probably going to have some FBI agents showing up looking at you saying, why you have bomb-making materials? But what you can do is find foods that have the uncoupling potential. And, Dr. Gundry is big about this, talks about the various different foods and mitochondrial uncoupling and the benefits for weight loss. So kudos to him for popularizing this. But some foods that are interesting, because even before I learned about this, foods that I just sort of knew, and you'll recognize one of them instantly, that have this sort of weight loss benefit because it's a mitochondrial uncoupler. Well, one of them is vinegar. Okay. So all those people with the apple cider vinegar and the apple cider, little cocktails that they take, and the reason why they're promoting this is in part because it has this uncoupling benefit. It helps you lose weight because it helps to raise your body temperature. Okay. Now, I know there's a lot of sugar in balsamic vinegar, but for my tastes, I'm Italian. I like balsamic vinegar. I find balsamic vinegar to be something that literally I could take a small little like dessert wine or cordial glass, fill it with, and just sip it, almost like sipping wine. It tastes a little getting used to, but it is a wonderful way to enhance weight loss simply by taking in some vinegar. Other things that are sort of odd, why would that be something that has a lot of polyphenols in it? But pumpkin seeds, loaded with polyphenols that are really great for uncoupling. And the other big one is, there's, yes, in colorful fruits and colorful vegetables, there's polyphenols. That's what gives the color. So eating the rainbow, we've had, guests that talk about this a lot. But another spice that's really, really good is cloves. In fact, the concentration of polyphenols in cloves is like 10 times greater than, blueberries and blackberries. Now, cloves is a pretty intense flavor. So I'm not suggesting that people go out and chew on cloves, although I could imagine, for any entrepreneur out there who's thinking about this, I could see like a little, tuck it between your cheek and gum little pack that's got ground up cloves in it.
Clove
might be a way, might be a way to help people lose weight. But these are all ways of ingesting chemicals that are natural, that are safe to take at reasonable dosages, and will have that similar effect, maybe not quite so robust as the 2,4-dinitrophenol, but it has the benefit of not having you on a terror watch list.
Yes, I think that is a huge benefit. All right, so we've got a few great ones there. We've talked a little bit about fasting. Let's chat about the mechanism by which fasting can support this cleanup process and support the mitochondrial uncoupling as well.
Sure. So fasting is a way of triggering a process in your cells that we've talked about, which is called autophagy. And mitochondria are really very, very tied into that whole process of triggering autophagy. And it is because when you drop the nutrient levels down, the signals that are happening inside the cell begin to shift in the direction of saying, hey, there's not enough fuel here to create ATP. So the mitochondrial engine or power plant starts to shut down. It's not completely shut down, of course, but it's shut down largely. And one of the ways in which the signals get to the cell, to the nucleus, to say, hey, we got to start creating the proteins and generating the tools for autophagy is through energy measurements, if you will. And there's something called AMP kinase. And basically, if you remember that ATP structure is the adenosine with 3 phosphate groups attached to it. most of the time when that energy is used, the ATP, the 3-phosphates, you give up the last phosphate and it becomes ADP. And then it goes to the mitochondria and it gets regenerated. Or, sometimes in the cytosol, you get, just a glycolytic addition of a phosphate onto the ATP. It's a very inefficient way of doing it compared to mitochondria. But when there's no ATP being generated or very little ATP being generated in the mitochondria, what happens is you take 2-ADP. There's an enzyme that does this. It takes 2-ADP and it takes one of the phosphate groups off one of the ADPs and adds it to the other ADP. So you end up with, instead of having two, the ADP and ADP, you end up with an ATP and an AMP. And this increase in the number of AMPs, which is a adenosine with only one adenosine monophosphate, only one phosphate group on it, the increase in the concentration of that AMP is something that the cell is very sensitive to. And at the point where that AMP has gotten to a high enough level, AMP kinase and that pathway kicks in and it creates this bag. It's basically just like a fat bag. It's almost like a cell within a cell. And that cell starts putting into that bag all the proteins that it doesn't need or are broken down or parts of organelles that are dysfunctional. And it goes into that bag. And then that bag merges with what's called a lysosome. And the lysosome is these little bags that are sitting inside the cell that have very caustic material inside them. And the purpose of them is to merge with this bag, or one of the purposes is to merge with this bag and to break down all of the things that were put in that bag, all those proteins and pieces of organelles that are dysfunctional and other things, misfolded proteins, and break them up into their constituent pieces. In there are the nutrients that your cell can use to rebuild things, because it's building blocks.
Yeah, it's like breaking down a huge Lego thing, but it's a distorted Lego castle that didn't work out. Break it down into its pieces, and then you can use those pieces again to support building something new.
Exactly. And so the mitochondria are critically involved in that signaling process, that cascade of shifting out of, okay, let's make a lot of energy, let's make a lot of proteins, into that state of, no, we need to recycle now. We need to get our building blocks not from the outside, but from the inside. And that allows more energy to be utilized also in the mitochondria, because the mitochondria doesn't have the energy that it needs from the outside. Now, sometimes those mitochondria will fuse together so that they can become more efficient. So there's lots of ways in which the mitochondria are involved in that process as well.
Does that, in theory, decrease mitochondrial activity because we're then going away from having numerous excessive mitochondria? And so we're going away from the idea of like a brown fat type of situation to more of a white fat situation? Or does that happen at a very low amount because you're generally not fasting for like 30 days or anything like that?
Yeah, it's at a low level, and there's lots of mitochondrial fusion and sort of the biogenesis where you're creating new mitochondria by splitting off.
Right.
It's really a function of whether or not the mitochondria are in an anabolic state or a catabolic state. But yes, you will, if you go without food for an extended period of time, you will lose your brown fat.
Right.
You'll end up with a whiter hue to that fat tissue.
But at the same time, you're going to use up a lot of that fat simply because of the process of fasting.
That's why I love seeing, I live down here in Florida where it does get really hot and humid. And when I first moved down here, I wasn't used to that. I was used to sort of the four seasons up north where I was, where I came from. And when I went outside, man, I would sweat. It was hot out. And I saw all these thin people who, I knew were exercising, and they were walking around in sweatshirts. And it was 90 degrees and 95% humidity. And I'm thinking to myself, how in the world can you be comfortable outside wearing a sweatshirt?
I still ask myself that question whenever I come to Florida and I see people like that.
I've reached the point now where I've put a hoodie on and gone outside when it's 90 degrees out, and I'm comfortable.
That's amazing.
It's just your body adapts.
That's really the cool thing about the body. When it comes to fasting, how long do you need to be in a fasted state to enable that cleaning up process of autophagy and these things to occur? Because there are some conflicting reports. I would love to hear what the research says and what you've come
Yeah,
across.
there are conflicting reports. I think it depends on what you do with with your body during that period of time. I've been talking about this here and elsewhere about the fact that the way I deal with it and the way I make certain that I'm in autophagy, on a regular basis is I exercise before I eat in the morning. I restrict my feeding window, if you will, to the afternoon and the early evening. I don't eat outside that window, but I exercise outside that window, and I exercise towards the end of the fasting cycle. So, right before we tend to record these podcasts at, sometime in the late morning. Inevitably, I've gone running beforehand. Today I did 9 miles. I'm quite certain that by 10 or 15 minutes into that run, there was no glycogen left. There was no, I was pushing my cells into that autophagy promoted state.
This is especially true if you're not eating a higher carb diet and because you're in that fasted state to begin with, right? So you're going to burn through that extra glycogen pretty quickly.
Yeah. So especially if you're going keto or at least, generally low carb, you're going to be in a ketogenic state. By the time I've started my run, I'm probably, at least a 1.5. And by the time I finish my run, I'm probably pushing 3, in terms of my ketone levels and the level of ketosis that I'm in. Now, you got to get used to that. And there are some physical differences that you can feel when you first start doing it. But now it's just totally normal for me. I don't find it uncomfortable. I don't find it, concerning or tiring at all. This is just the normal state for me.
So in a situation like yours, where you're eating a lower carb, almost keto carnivore style diet, where you're fasting, doing like a 16-8 approximate fast, 16 hours fasting, 8-hour feeding window, and you're completing your cardio / training workout, fasted exercise workout, primarily with running at the probably 12 to 15 hour mark of fasting, you're going to enter ketosis far more readily. And that's a direct sign that you are cleaning things up and you're entering autophagy a little bit more easily.
And the reason for that is because my insulin levels are so low. So I will say, if I had a big pasta dinner the night before, no, I'm not going to be in ketosis. I'm not going to be pushing into autophagy. I've got, huge glycogen stores. I've got, there's probably still glucose floating around in the system at that point. I'd have to run 15 miles to even approach, burning it all off. But when I don't do that, and last night I had steak, which is pretty normal for me, and that means that I go into that run with extremely low insulin levels. I go in with, very low glycogen stores, if any, and right from the get-go, I'm burning ketones. My liver's probably been producing ketones since, midnight, and I'm in ketosis. And, there are people who worry that, when you're in that state, you're not going to run as well. Hey, listen, I ran 9 miles today. I don't have a problem with it.
And you've adapted. I think that's the key thing, is when people aren't used to it and they're used to carb loading prior to doing an endurance exercise type of thing, creating that shift where you are becoming used to fueling through fat and enabling your muscles to function primarily on a fat-based supportive metabolic process, it's going to take time to create that shift, right? So for most people that are carb loading, they're going to say, man, I can't do it on fat. You haven't given your body enough time to adapt effectively, I think, is the key thing there.
And that's why I always tell people, it's like, if you've been in that sort of traditional North American lifestyle that we're saying is not so healthy, and you've been there, and then you decide, okay, I'm gonna get into this. I'm gonna go to the gym. I'm gonna work out, and I'm gonna do all the right things. I'm gonna eat the right things, and then you don't see any change, and you actually feel kind of run down. You feel kind of crappy, and you get 2 to 3 weeks into it, no weight's come off. You might even have gained some weight and you're frustrated. That's the point at which I say you should never have expected to lose weight during that first month or so. Okay. During that first 3 to 6 weeks, you're getting your mitochondria into the shape necessary so that you can lose weight. Okay. Because you were in a state before that where not only weren't you doing the exercise and things to lose weight, your body was not in a position where it even could. You have to get your mitochondria into a point and your insulin levels down and your liver functioning properly so that you are capable of losing weight. And then once you do, the weight will come off so easily. I mean, I realize this is going to sound, but you do literally get to the point where you've lost the weight, where you think to yourself, boy, I wish that I could just help somebody else out and I'll lose the weight for them because I've got my engine running at the point where I can do it now and they're not there yet. And yeah, it's really frustrating. You got to go through those 3 to 6 weeks of sort of not seeing any benefits and actually feeling kind of crappy.
It's the prep phase, yeah.
But you know what? It's like anything else. Practice is not fun, but the games are fun, and everybody loves to see watch somebody play who really knows how to play, but they don't think about the grind that it took to get there. So, you just got to put the grind in. It's not, and the beautiful thing is the body doesn't take very long to do it. Only 3 to 6 weeks.
In the grand scheme is much shorter than a lot of people would think it would be. So I think having a reasonable expectation, if that's the plan that you intend to go on or follow, knowing that it will take a little bit of time, but once you get through that initial step, things will fall into place far more easily, I think is probably the most important piece here. If somebody is not on the style of diet like you, where it's a relatively low carb, almost carnivore-esque diet, and they're not doing the fasting as often, right? So you're doing, I believe, between 5 and 7 days a week of 16-8 fasting.
It's every day. It's every day. Yeah.
For somebody who's not doing that, where they're normally kind of following, I wouldn't say a full standard American diet, but a cleaner diet, but they're considering this, do you feel like they would need longer in a fasted state to enable that autophagy process and cleaning up to occur?
Yes. In fact, I think that's why you see the variability in the literature.
Exactly. I think that makes sense.
You see these people online talking about how you get into autophagy within 12 hours or 15 hours. For the vast majority of people, that's not true.
Exactly.
Not true at all. For those people, it could take 24, 36, 48 hours of fasting before you start to really see some significant autophagy. But if you get yourself into that low insulin, low sugar, low carb state, it doesn't have to be all the way to ketogenic, but if you also are layering in significant levels of working out, then by all means, it's a simple process. It's about energy. It's about measuring the level of AMP that's building up in the cells because you've used up the energy. If you've used up the ATP, and muscles are a great way to do that, use your muscles, and you will then increase the amount of AMP, drive AMP kinase pathways to generate, the bag, and you're gonna go through that process of autophagy much more quickly.
What else can people do? You mentioned, now we've talked a little bit about kind of the fasting specific ways to support the mitochondrial uncoupling, mitochondrial efficiency overall. We talked about vinegar, we talked about clove, we talked about high polyphenol diet. I think those are huge for people pumpkin seeds being a big part of that. Are there any other practices? We talked about temperature therapy as well. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a full cold immersion. For some people, they can't do it. If you have like a Raynaud's phenomenon, something like that happening, you're obviously not going to move towards a cold plunge immediately. And for a lot of people, there's a stressor of not wanting to get into cold, which I understand. There is pathways you can take. Even just starting with cold water on your face is a great way to get started with that process. And just shifting how your body handles that and telling yourself and realizing that you're completely safe while you're doing something simple like that. Are there any other practices, any other exercises, any other specifics that people can plug into their daily life that are relatively easy that they can do that to support mitochondrial uncoupling to take place?
One big one, There's one big one, and it's one we talk about a lot on this show. Vagus nerve activation. Vagus nerve activation does it because it has multiple effects. First off, it's going to lower your insulin levels. It's going to make your insulin, the amount of insulin that's necessary to move glucose out of your bloodstream and into your muscles and into your cells is going to be vastly lower, because the amount of insulin you need is proportional to how functional your insulin receptors are. Okay. And if your insulin receptors are constantly being sabotaged from the inside because of inflammation, and that's what inflammation does. Inflammation creates proteins, it causes the generation of proteins inside your cells. They're called SOX proteins, suppressors of cytokine signaling, because your cells are resisting the inflammation. Okay. SOX1 and SOX3 totally sabotage the insulin receptor substrate. So as a result, inflammation leads to your cells becoming insulin resistant. Get rid of the inflammation, get more insulin responsive, insulin sensitive. You need less insulin. Now, less insulin means that your fat cells will be very happy to give up their fat stores. When insulin levels are high, the very first signal it says to the fat cells is, don't give up the fat. Hold on to the fat. The reason is because it's expecting it's going to have to take even more in. Okay. So get those insulin levels down, get your inflammation levels down, get your autonomic nervous system into a parasympathetic state. Now, the other thing that it does, which is really fascinating, is it's not only taking the glucose out of the bloodstream and putting it into the muscles, it's driving the synthesis of glycogen. Okay, so in your body, when you take in sugar, your body's going to circulate that sugar around, and then it's going to decide, well, I'm not using it right now. I don't want to have this high level of sugar. So I'm going to try to push it into the muscles. And if I can't, I'm going to, in my liver, create glycogen. I'm going to create the safer storage form of glucose that can then be released, and it's like instant energy. Okay. Vagus nerve activation, parasympathetic activation, increases the activity of glycogen synthetase, which is an enzyme that turns glucose into glycogen. So you're activating that process by enhancing the glycogen synthetase process expression. Now, the final thing that your liver does, I literally just got asked this question yesterday on the way to dinner with my family. Okay. One of my kids asked, how important is your liver? I said, do you want to know how important your liver is? Your liver is so important, okay, that when you are first conceived, okay, in your mother's womb, the very first place that those tissue resident macrophages go, that's going to literally build you, it goes to your brain, the place where your brain is going to be built. We've talked about that many times. It goes to a little spot called the aortic arch where your heart is going to be built. It goes into your skin, okay? I mean, we got skin everywhere, okay? It goes there, and it goes to your liver, okay? Those are the 4 spots. So those are the 4 most important places that need to get built just to even start the process. And then all of that activity, generating all those tissue resident macrophages that are going to do all the rest of the building, they come out of your liver. Your liver spends all of that time during gestation being the place where your blood is made. All those white blood cells, all those macrophages are made in your liver. It will ultimately transfer into your bone marrow, but that's where it is during gestation. So that's how important your liver is. The other really, really important thing that your liver does is it creates those ketones. It is the place where your ketone bodies are created. So if you're on a restricted food window diet, we'll call it intermittent fasting, probably sometime in the middle of the night, you're going to have used up all the glucose that you have in your body. You're going to have used up most of the glycogen, and you're going to start with your liver mobilizing the fat out of fat cells, going to the liver, being turned into ketones that then go out to your muscles, into your brain, and other places where energy is needed to convert you over into a ketone body dependent or ketogenic state. And that is where you lose weight. That's how weight comes off easily, to the point where you will literally look at other people and say, I wish I could just take your fat and lose it for you. Okay. I realize that sounds crazy, but that's literally, it would be, could you imagine the industry if you could just say, oh, listen, the way you lose weight is you go in and you pay somebody and they lose your weight for you. Wow. That would be pretty amazing.
Well, I don't feel like we're that far off from something like that coming up. I think
I'm sure there's some entrepreneur out there who's going to say, I got to figure out how to do that.
AI is going to help them along the way, figure out how to make that happen, I'm sure, or in some way, transferability of metabolic flexibility over from one person to another. I think that would be really cool.
I'll put that in a grok later and see.
I love it. Wonderful. I think this has been really insightful for a lot of people to understand how mitochondria work, how we can create more efficiency within mitochondrial function, support mitochondrial function, because ultimately that is, without energy, no cell can do whatever job it needs to do. Not the vagus nerve, not any nerve cell, not any liver cell, not any brain cell. Nothing can do it without the energy piece. So efficiency of metabolic flexibility, of metabolic function is, I think, paramount to every single piece that we're talking about. So if we can do that, we can support upgrading health in a very positive way for everybody. Any final thoughts as we kind of wrap a bow on this one?
Yeah, I would throw out a couple of things we've talked about before on this podcast with some guests, and I would just throw out the importance of antioxidants that are able to get inside the mitochondria and actually function to kill off those free radicals, to quench those toxins that are being generated when our mitochondria aren't functioning as efficiently as they should be. Those are things like glutathione and melatonin. And there's, we've got RFK out there talking about the fact, and it's showing the fact that he uses methylene blue. There's likely a place for methylene blue as well in just the overall housekeeping and upkeep of your mitochondria and optimizing them. So I don't personally use methylene blue, but I do think that there's a place for it, especially for people who aren't necessarily doing all the things and spending the time to do the things that maybe somebody like some nutbag like me uses. Running 9 miles in the morning, that's probably more excessive than most people want to do.
I rode my bike 25 kilometers, which is equivalent to about 14 miles this morning. So I hear you. I don't do it every day. I can't get out of the house every day, mostly because I'm in Toronto, but and secondarily because, wife needs to work out too. So I appreciate where you're coming from. And I think all of this advice is very useful for everybody to understand. And that's really the intent. That this podcast is all about bringing you the tips and practical advice that can help to upgrade your performance, upgrade your flexibility and your capability and your overall health, because without health, we don't have anything. So I think this has been a really good episode in terms of bringing a lot of important pieces together and talking about what are some of the practical things that people can implement from today to support their overall mitochondrial function. I love it. I think this was great. If you got to this point in the podcast, thanks for listening. Share this episode with 1, 2, 3 people who you think could utilize this information to truly upgrade their health. And we'll catch you all on the next one.